Imagine you're the owner of a multi-billion-dollar empire, living a life most can only dream of. Expensive cars, luxury mansions, and a business that practically prints money. But with wealth and power comes danger. For the New York billionaire, his success didn't just attract attention, it also attracted someone with evil intentions. This is the incredible true story of how a billionaire survived an attempted kidnapping that could have cost him everything. To continue this story, please, like, and subscribe to this channel. This story started in a quiet, luxury penthouse, 45 stories above the bustling city of New York. This penthouse belonged to David Maxwell, one of the world's most successful tech billionaires. His company, a global leader in artificial intelligence, was changing the world. He had everything: money, fame, and influence. But not everything in David's world was perfect. A business empire of his size always draws attention, both good and bad. While his business ventures flourished, dark forces began to circle. It all began one evening, after a long day of meetings, when David received a call. A call that would change his life forever. The voice on the other end of the call was calm but chilling. "We have your son, David. If you don't meet our demands, you'll never see him again." David's heart skipped a beat. His son, Ethan, only 8 years old, was his pride and joy. The voice demanded an outrageous ransom, millions of dollars in cryptocurrency, untraceable and impossible to track. David paced around his office. His gut told him to involve the authorities immediately, but the last thing he wanted was to risk his son's life. The kidnappers had made it clear, if he tried anything clever, they wouldn't hesitate to harm Ethan. He spent the next few hours preparing. He called in his closest team members but instructed them to stay quiet. They weren't to tell anyone, not even the police, until he was safe. David's mind raced. He had been through negotiations before, but nothing had prepared him for this. The kidnappers' instructions were simple: David was to meet them at an isolated warehouse on the edge of town at midnight. There, he would hand over the ransom, and they would return his son. It seemed like the perfect plan, or at least, that's what the kidnappers thought. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It felt too easy. His mind flashed through all the ways this could go wrong. He had been in risky situations before, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals and battling cutthroat business rivals, but this was different. This wasn't business, it was life and death. At 11:45 p.m., David was dressed in a black suit, ready for the exchange. He knew he was walking into a dangerous situation, but he also knew he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he picked up the briefcase containing the ransom and got into his car, his thoughts consumed by one question: would he be able to save Ethan? When David arrived at the warehouse, the city was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. The only light came from the moon, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He felt a cold chill run down his spine as he stepped out of the car, clutching the briefcase tightly in his hand. He glanced around, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and intimidating. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and graffiti on the walls. David's heart raced as he approached the entrance. As he stepped closer, the door creaked open. A man in a black suit stepped out from the shadows, holding a gun. His face was partially covered by a mask, but his eyes glinted with menace. David froze. The man's eyes were cold, and calculating. "The money," he said flatly, extending his hand. David hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and handed over the briefcase. "Where is my son?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The kidnapper said nothing. Instead, he gestured for David to follow him into the dark warehouse. As David stepped inside, he noticed something strange. The warehouse was empty, no sign of his son. There were no other kidnappers. David's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, from the shadows, a voice shouted, "Get down!" Before David could react, a man in a dark suit tackled him to the ground, knocking the briefcase out of his hands. In that split second, David realized what had happened. The entire thing had been a setup. The police, his own security team, had been tracking the kidnappers from the start. The kidnappers weren't criminals at all, they were undercover officers, and the man who had tackled him was his head of security. David's team had orchestrated the entire rescue operation, keeping him in the dark to prevent the kidnappers from realizing they had been caught. The police swarmed the warehouse moments later, arresting the fake kidnappers and rescuing Ethan, who had been safe the whole time. The news spread quickly. Headlines across the world read, "Billionaire David Maxwell survives kidnapping attempt." The story went viral, but David wasn't interested in the media attention. All that mattered was that his son was safe. David Maxwell never wanted to be the story. He preferred the quiet control of his empire, the tech world's quiet giant. But this harrowing experience, one that had threatened everything he had worked for, made him realize that nothing in life should be taken for granted, not even for the wealthiest of men. In the days that followed, David couldn't shake the feeling of relief mixed with guilt. He had nearly walked into a deadly trap, and his son had been right there, all along, out of harm's way. The fake kidnapping had been the work of his security team, who had acted quickly and decisively to keep him and his family safe. But the experience left David shaken. He had always been in control of his empire, but this incident reminded him that nothing in life was certain, not even the safety of his loved ones. Days after the failed kidnapping, David received another mysterious call. This time, the voice was different. "You think you've won, David? This is just the start. We're coming for you, and we'll get what we want, one way or another." David's heart raced again. Who were these people? Why were they targeting his family? The voice promised more chaos if David didn't comply with their demands. It was clear now that the kidnapping was just the first step in a larger plan. David knew he couldn't back down. He had survived the first threat, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. He decided to take action, but not just any action. He would go on the offensive. David wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who had built his fortune on innovation, and he was going to use his resources to turn the tables. He secretly hired the best private investigators and a team of former military operatives. His new plan wasn't just to protect his family. It was to find out who was behind this network and put a stop to them once and for all. With his security team working behind the scenes, David also set up a series of traps. The next time the kidnappers made contact, David would be ready. He would not only protect his family but ensure these criminals were caught. A week later, the kidnappers made their move. They tried to take Ethan again, this time using a different strategy, an ambush in the city. But David had already anticipated this. His team had tracked the movements of the criminals, and when they arrived, they were met with a well-planned counterattack. The situation turned into chaos. Police surrounded the area, and a tense standoff began. David, although nervous for his son, knew that this was the only way to end it. He had everything in place, and the time had come. The criminals were finally exposed. The leader, a man with a deep history of organized crime, was arrested on the spot. But it wasn't just the kidnappers who were involved, there were connections to several high-ranking officials who had been aiding the operation from the shadows. As the investigation unfolded, David learned the disturbing truth. His wealth had made him a target not just for criminals, but for people with powerful connections. The kidnapping plot wasn't random, it was part of a larger scheme to control parts of his tech empire. Some of his own colleagues were involved, having sold information to the criminals in exchange for a piece of his company. If you found this story shocking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more intense real-life billionaire stories. Want to hear how another billionaire survived a life-threatening ordeal? Comment below with your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next story.